Thank you, Dr. Arakaki. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. It's a shame we can't all be together in Tokyo, but hopefully in the next year that will be possible again. After nearly 4 decades of geopolitical stability, the competition amongst great powers has returned to Asia. From Sino-American rapprochement in the 1970s through until the accession of Xi Jinping to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and his implementation of a much more competitive approach to China's foreign and defense policy, the region enjoyed dramatic economic growth and the attendant integration that it created as China's expansion forged a genuinely pan-Asian regional economy. At this time, the region explored multilateralism in a range of domains, and most notably in relation to international security. By the early 2010s, scholars and commentators described a security architecture which was inclusive in its broader outlook and sought to adopt a cooperative way of managing the diverse array of traditional and non-traditional security challenges confronting the region. Today, great power competition casts a long shadow. The US and China each have incompatible views of the region, see each other as antagonistic towards their interests, and are settling in for a sustained period of overt competition. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has further unsettled the region and shown that the risks of conflict are very real, particularly given that the respective stake that the US and China have in key flashpoints are much greater than those that they have in Eastern Europe. This context makes the emergence of minilateralism an interesting and telling aspect of Asia's international security environment. The revitalization of the Quad and the creation of the AUKUS partnership reflect both the ways in which exclusive and competitive tendencies have come to replace inclusive and cooperative instincts in the region, as well as the impact of great power competition on the dynamics of Asia's international landscape. Now, during the Cold War, Asia was notable for its reluctance to embrace the broader global trend toward multilateralism. ASEAN's creation in 1967 was the sole example, and for its first 3 decades, the grouping was focused on intra-elite solidarity to facilitate post-colonial state and nation-building programs in the context of Cold War competition. To advance their security interests, regional powers looked after themselves or sought to bolster their own efforts with support in the form of alliances. The series of bilateral security arrangements established in the early years of the Cold War enabled the US to organize the Asian theater of its global contest with the Soviet Union and provided defense and security guarantees for junior partners. Washington's decision to retain the Cold War logic and structure of its Asia policy, set out in the 1995 and 1998 Nye reports, meant that the alliance arrangements remained unchanged after the Soviet collapse. But alongside this more realist mode of advancing security interests, in the 1990s and early 2000s, Asian states began to explore the possibilities of security multilateralism. Over a decade and a half, Asia moved from having essentially no forms of security multilateralism to a situation in which, according to at least some critics, it had almost too many. This began with the creation of the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1994, as the Southeast Asian grouping recognized that the primary security challenges facing the organization and its members would come from outside Southeast Asia. It included the establishment of other ASEAN-centered bodies like the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus process and the East Asia Summit. It also involved adding security matters to the work agenda of APEC, which had, prior to the turn of the millennium, assiduously avoided the topic, as well as the creation of a number of minilateral groupings, such as the Trilateral Security Dialogue involving Japan, Australia, and the United States, the Six-Party Talks, and the short-lived first version of the Quad. During this period, Japan and Australia both advocated for yet more groupings, Kevin Rudd's Asia-Pacific Community and Hatoyama Yukio's East Asia Community being those two examples. However, these did not eventuate. China was also an active participant in this process as a member of these new mechanisms, and it also established the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and sought to re-energize the Conference on Interaction and Confidence-Building Measures in Asia. The culmination of this period was the accession of Russia and the United States to the East Asia Summit in 2011. By that time, the idea that the region had a security architecture began to be used in scholarship and policy circles to describe the mix of security mechanisms states were using to advance their interests. The US alliance system retained its importance for those within its orbit, with many strengthening and expanding their bilateral ties with the US, even as they embraced multilateralism. Realist instincts remained, even though the liberal ideas of multilateralism were flowering across the region. States were turning to multilateral security initiatives for a number of reasons. The most immediate was due to the complex array of security threats and challenges they were facing caused by globalization. The trade and investment ties that brought significant prosperity also opened societies up to vulnerabilities that required multi-state collaboration. But it was not just the need to deal with transnational terrorism or infectious diseases that led to the creation of expansive and ambitious entities such as the East Asia Summit. Many also saw that the existing regional balance of power was changing, and advocates for multilateralism saw in these large gatherings an opportunity to influence the major powers. Indeed, some even argued that the institutions had the potential to enmesh the major powers in their modes of operation, and potentially act as a means through which a new regional order could be more cooperatively managed. And notwithstanding its somewhat cluttered setting, Asia had achieved a great deal, with an architecture that was inclusive and cooperative, and through which the states of the world's most dynamic region could try to manage their security interests. More than 10 years since the expansion of the East Asia Summit, the promise of this architecture has not been fulfilled. The speed with which the US and China have moved into a period of enmity and competition is remarkable. And the tragic inability of the many multilateral bodies to make any meaningful response to the COVID pandemic, a crisis of the kind that these bodies really ought to have been able to respond to, has shown just how hollow that vision of security multilateralism was. Yet, just because geopolitical contestation, the return of nationalism, and a global pandemic have hobbled the more expansive entities, states have not stopped seeking to work with one another to advance their security interests. But where in the past they had turned to inclusive and cooperative bodies, now it is entities that are exclusive and competitive that have captured the policy imagination. As the region began to experiment with expansive bodies, it also dabbled with more narrowly focused forms of collaboration. These minilateral groupings, so called to distinguish entities that involve more than two members, but which have a circumscribed membership, from larger cooperative groupings, were present at the margins of state priorities and at the attentions of analysts and scholars. But no more. Minilaterals have come to the fore as their scale allows them to move swiftly, and their narrow functional focus promises a tangible grip on policy outcomes of the kind the larger multilateral bodies have found so difficult to achieve. The Quadrilateral Security Initiative, as it was then styled, was created in 2007, bringing together Australia, India, Japan, and the United States to discuss shared regional security concerns. Japan's then Prime Minister, Abe Shinzo, was its most visible and articulate advocate. Yet the group dissipated in a little over 12 months, reflecting the significant gaps that existed amongst them about their broader security interests, as well as the fact that the grouping was not well suited to the geopolitical circumstances of that time. The group was reconvened 10 years later, prompted by the deteriorating security environment and the growing convergence of interests amongst the four. The first meeting was held on the margins of the 2017 East Asia Summit and was followed by a number of meetings of security officials and military officers in 2019. In that same year, the Quad foreign ministers met in New York alongside the UN General Assembly meeting in September, with a follow-up ministerial gathering in Tokyo in 2020 and a virtual meeting in early 2021. The Quad then instituted an inaugural leaders-level meeting hosted by Joe Biden, and the most recent of which was hosted by Kishida Fumio in May of this year. Although the revived Quad has moved away from the formal title of its first instantiation, it is simply the Quad in all of the formal statements and communiques, it remains primarily focused on security cooperation with, ostensibly at least, a particular emphasis on coordinating military operations and aligning the direction of security and strategic policy amongst its members. In the statement issued following the first of the leaders' meetings, the group set out its vision in expansive terms. The Quad aims to promote the free, open, rules-based order, rooted in international law and undaunted by coercion, to bolster security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. It is clear that although the Quad is primarily focused on security, it is also about underlining the means of prosperity and also concerned with the protection of a particular configuration of regional order. This move from security grouping narrowly understood in military terms to a more expansive body is notable. The The Quad has established programs related to climate change, public health, vaccination, and high technology. And in this year, it added infrastructure, educational exchange, humanitarian disaster relief, and space to its burgeoning agenda. This reflects the realization that in the contemporary world, security is multifaceted and requires more than just coordination of defense policies and joint military programs and exercises. It is also a realization that the larger challenge of geopolitical competition amongst the great powers is itself expansive, entailing not only traditional jostling for influence over the military balance and areas of strategic significance, but it is also about infrastructure, standards, new frontiers of technology, and indeed the substance of the region's international rules of the road. For the Quad to make a meaningful contribution to advancing shared aims in relation to this competition does require engagement across the spectrum. The Quad has thus rapidly moved through the gears in the 5 years since it reconvened. Yet, this expansion of the agenda is notable for two distinct facets. First, it does not have any programs for work, nor has it signalled any intention to establish collaboration in relation to matters of the economy beyond some talk around infrastructure. Given the way in which the People's Republic of China is able to use its economic weight to advance its foreign policy agenda, this lack of an economic dimension is striking. It also reveals the significant gaps in interest and policy inclination that exists amongst the four members in that domain. Second, the expansion of the agenda seemingly departs from the logic and appeal of minilateral groupings more broadly. Minilateral's ability to focus on narrow and potentially complex or contentious issues which larger, more wide-ranging groupings find too difficult. One of the abiding lessons of Asia's rapid expansion of inclusive and cooperative multilateralism is that big and ambitious agendas present a major problem, both in terms of the scale of work that has to be undertaken, as well as for the credibility of the process. Among the reasons why bodies like the ASEAN Regional Forum and East Asia Summit are perceived to fall short is that they have failed to deliver meaningfully on an expansive and ambitious agenda. Indeed, because of the speed and breadth of the issue expansion undertaken by the Quad, some scholars have even questioned whether or not it can still be described as a security institution. At best, the widening out of the scope dilutes its capacity to act on core security business. At worst, it risks suffering from the same fate as the larger mechanisms, that is, becoming seen as little more than a talk shop. Now, this remains a problem of potential. There are, however, some already evident weaknesses with the grouping's activities. The most obvious of which is that in its half-decade of reconstitution, it has not undertaken any meaningful steps to turn its ambitious rhetoric into policy substance. It remains firmly in the realm of diplomatic and strategic signalling and of policy solidarity. Now, to be clear, these things matter in international politics, but they should not be confused with action. Now, one scholar has argued that the Quad's members, particularly the three resident Asian powers, have considerable potential to have an important strategic effect by filling the time gap that exists between any activity to change the status quo and the United States' ability to respond to see that challenge off. In short, by pooling resources of resident powers, the Quad could act as an immediate deterrent. But that remains in the realm of potential, and one that, given the current status, remains a long way from being realized. The second major problem is there are real limits to what the four states can meaningfully do together. With the exception of the United States, the members have significant operational constraints on their militaries, and their capacity to take collaborative steps of the kind that would impose costs on China or some other putative challenge is highly limited. Given the budgetary and political constraints the three face, it is unlikely that they can rectify this in the short to medium term. Finally, while the security interests of the four powers have converged in some areas, all share a high level of unease about rising Chinese power, there remain significant gaps between the four on a range of security and security-adjacent domains, and none more clearly illustrates this than the not at all unified response of the Quad members to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Australia-United Kingdom-United States Trilateral Security Partnership, or AUKUS, was announced on the 16th of September 2021. Partners of the three were given little, or indeed no, advance warning, and indeed many branches of government within the three members were also unaware of its establishment. AUKUS is intended to strengthen the shared security interests of the three participants in the region by increasing the individual and collective defence capabilities through technology sharing. This takes its most visible form in the commitment by the members to support Australia to acquire, deploy and maintain at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines. The move was surprising for a number of reasons, beyond the shock of Australia taking the expensive and diplomatically damaging decision to cancel its contract with the French Naval Group. Most obviously, it puts the sharing of complex and controversial technology at the forefront. Nuclear options had previously been ruled out by Australia for both political and technical reasons, and the US and the UK had also previously been unwilling to share such technology even to allies. It also displays a risk appetite and a level of disregard for partners and friends that sits uneasily with the longer-run practice of Australian diplomacy. To take such drastic steps, the members clearly perceive the region to be entering a period of sustained strategic risk. While AUKUS is technically a minilateral grouping, it is unlike more common forms of multilateral security cooperation. Conventional groups, whether large or small, are primarily about intergovernmental policy coordination to advance shared security goals. AUKUS is a means to advance broader security goals through concrete developments in technical areas. And in this sense, it is less a piece of security architecture and more a kind of interstate industrial policy. And in this sense, its prospects of having an impact on the security dynamics of the region are in fact greater than more conventional forms of interstate collaboration. Now, for some months after the initial announcement, AUKUS remained little more than a press release, at least viewed from outside government. In part, this reflected the complex politics in each country, but also the challenges of navigating an entirely new area of interstate collaboration. More than a year on, however, the partnership has begun to be fleshed out in terms of the specific intent of the collaborative programs, and unsurprisingly has become a key component of the members' broader policy planning. AUKUS is repeatedly named in the recently published Biden National Security Strategy, is central to Australian long-term strategic planning, and crucial to the United Kingdom's plans in the Indo-Pacific. Now, the AUKUS partnership has 2 pillars of operation. The first is focused on the submarine program and is intended to provide a full spectrum set of operations to deliver nuclear-powered submarines for Australia to be deployed as soon as possible. Australia was committed to making the submarines in-country, and as this is a hugely complex task, and one for which Australia is presently poorly equipped, the governments currently expect the vessels to be operational in the 2040s. Now, given the speed with which the strategic environment in Asia has deteriorated, many analysts argue that this is simply too long, and periodically there are reports in the media about efforts to bring forward the timelines through the acquisition of old American or British submarines or some other set of interim arrangements. The second pillar is about sharing technologies to develop advanced capabilities in a wide range of areas. Now, at the time of writing, those to which the 3 are committed include undersea capabilities, quantum technology, AI, cyber, hypersonic and counter-hypersonic capabilities, electronic warfare, innovation, and information sharing. Now, to advance the ambitious goals under both pillars, the 3 governments have carved out dedicated bureaucratic resources. The United States National Security Council has established an AUKUS director to manage the broader interagency process, while the Department of Defence has an AUKUS senior advisor, currently veteran Asia hand Abe Denmark, alongside a senior naval officer. Australia has established roles in all of the key governmental institutions. This includes a nuclear-powered submarine task force established in the Department of Defence. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has set up an AUKUS task force, and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has formed a nuclear-powered submarine and national naval shipbuilding enterprise group. While the UK has reportedly allocated roles within the Ministry of Defence, these are not yet publicly available. And the first regulatory hurdle has been cleared with the completion of negotiations and the signing of the Exchange of Naval Nuclear Propulsion Information Agreement in February 2022. AUKUS is notable because it represents a harder edge to security cooperation from both the US and Australia. In contrast to the Quad, which has adopted a public rhetoric heavily focused on ASEAN and its modes of security cooperation, AUKUS seems unconcerned with the diplomatic consequences of its actions. Regional powers such as Indonesia are disconcerted by the move and the proliferation risks it represents, Yet efforts to assuage these concerns have been scant and ineffective. The speed of its emergence and the depth of resource commitment is illustrative of the shift in mood in the region. Australia, for example, was an enthusiastic multilateralist and approached regional efforts inspired by the liberal notions that cooperation among states in one area would have knock-on effects in others. While that flame has not entirely gone out, the motivations behind AUKUS and the actions undertaken to date make clear that this sentiment no longer commands the room in Washington, Canberra, or indeed London. Where inclusive and cooperative instincts once ruled the day, now hard-edged competitive dynamics are what matters most. Now, the central motivation behind the growth of exclusive and hard-edged minilateral groupings in the region is the rise of geopolitical competition and a highly unsettled regional security environment. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only served to accentuate those perceptions. Many assume that the self-evident risks and costs of a full-scale invasion would mean that Putin would be deterred from action. Yet his willingness to defy conventional cost-benefit calculations shows that the risk-reward calculus varies much more widely than perhaps we previously recognized. The risk of Asia's many long-running flashpoints escalating into war is perhaps higher than we may previously have recognized. This is not to say that she is likely to follow Putin's lead and launch an attack on Taiwan, but rather to emphasize that when assessing the prospects of acute security crises in the region, Ukraine reminds us to be more conservative than perhaps we would have been in the past. This sentiment further erodes support for the old multilateralism and increases the prospects of exclusive and competitive mechanisms over the short to medium term. It is reasonable, therefore, to expect more agreements among states to develop military technologies, pool resources, and balance power, and fewer Baroque initiatives to advance a common sense of community across the region. There is one other interesting way in which the Ukraine war may affect the minilateralism that I have discussed. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the response of the US and many others was to impose heavy sanctions on the Russian Federation, including locking many of the country's banks out of parts of the international financial system. The extent and reach of these sanctions took many observers by surprise. Yet Russia's resilience in the face of this remains because the West has not yet been willing to sanction the full range of Russian hydrocarbon exports. And while China would have taken note of the financial power that the US and its allies were able to wield, it will also have noted what it was not able to do. So one potential step that minilateral groupings might take is to coordinate ways in which they manage economic coercion that may be deployed to punish or deter aggression, whether from the PRC or from another source. Now, of course, this would be enormously challenging, particularly among the Quad members who have shown a decided lack of solidarity in responding to Ukraine, but it remains a powerful tool if the participants in minilateral groupings could muster the political will to use it. To conclude, great power competition has returned to Asia, and the threat of high-intensity war increases seemingly by the day. 10 years ago, the risk of a conflict was not zero in Asia, but the idea that the PRC and the US would take steps leading to mutually assured economic destruction was almost unthinkable. Now, senior figures on both sides of the Pacific openly discuss the imminent prospects of war. Once optimistic political leaders, like Kevin Rudd, now concede the strategic future is extremely gloomy. It is not surprising, therefore, that inclusive and cooperative forms of security cooperation are withering, and in turn, mechanisms that advance a harder-edged vision of security and which advance the participants' relative position within a competitive strategic dynamic are the order of the day. Yet, as I have sought to show, there remains limits as to what these minilateral groupings can achieve. Whether this is because of the scale of the technological task, many seasoned analysts have argued that even if Australia eventually is able to sail its nuclear-powered submarines, it will be far too late. Or because of the way the region's political economy has been reconstituted by the PRC has meant that aligning strategic interests to manage Chinese power is almost impossible. The likelihood is that minilateral groupings will only ever make a marginal contribution to Asia's strategic balance. Thank you.